Hi, I'm Josh, and welcome to my very late second quarter review. So this is going to span the months of April to June, beginning of April into June, and right now we're in the middle of quarter three. So I'm clearly very behind in this, but this is really important to me just to keep track of my reading stats, and also so when I get to the end of the year I don't have a shit ton of work to do. But it's important to me to make sure that I'm meeting my goals, and if I'm not, I need to think about how I'm going to try and fix that. So let's get right into it. This month I read 53 books. That's 7 books less than, not this month, this quarter I read 53 books. That's 7 less than the first quarter, which I'm okay with. Honestly, I made a conscious effort to try and read less. I've had a hard time sticking to that, and I know that seems weird, trying to read less. It's because I had this sort of obsessive focus on it, and honestly there's no better way of describing it. It's just because I let it stress me out, and that I set so many goals that are so ambitious that it just doesn't give me time to relax. And it's a fine line of trying to read all the books I want to read while still recognizing that it's okay to take my time. And so that's something I've been struggling with. Let's start with my ratings. I think I've had a slight improvement over my first quarter, which is I have a better distribution. There's still a great deal of 4.5 and 5 stars, and my highest is really 4 stars, which I'm okay with. And I've got a lot better at giving 3 stars instead of just a bunch of 3.5 stars. One thing I haven't gotten better at is 2 and 1 stars. I would love some advice on how the hell you decide to give a book 1 star. I barely finish a book if I give it 2 stars, and maybe I'm just being too generous in general. I need to redistribute, but it's something I'm still trying to reckon with. Moving on to pages. I'm pretty sure there was a focus on 300 to 400 pages, which I'm happy with. I like reading longer books, and it's also more satisfying to me, so I want to try and get more of those longer books on the high end. I don't want most of my reading to be on the lower end, which I don't think it normally is, but it's just a preference. And since I read it by audio, it's not usually something I find too taxing, unless it's like a genre I don't love and I get tired of. Next up with years, and it's important to look at the x-axis here. We have, starting out on the far right, or is it your far left? 2020. I have, in 2020 and 2019, I have 7 or 8 books that I read from published in those years. And you move on to 2016 and 2018, remember that's 3 years, 16, 17, 18. And those are the highest, but if you take 15 divided by 3, it's 5 books. So just over 5 books on average for those 3 years, which is less than 2019 and 2018. Going back, you see a continual decrease, even though I'm increasing the span of these years. This, I think, is heavily influenced by the fact that I used to be buying a lot of my books from Book Outlet, and most of their supply is from recent years. And I'm hoping this will start changing as I buy more books from other places now. That said, I do want to try and read more backlist. I mean, I don't plan on changing my process at all. I'm just hoping it'll naturally fix itself as I buy books from different sources. I'll also add that I don't buy that many new books. There are a few authors that I'm in love with that I'll buy brand new immediately. Otherwise, I'm willing to wait. So now moving on to the really exciting stuff, this beautiful graph that I love that I made. Of all the genres that I read, I have color-coded as general genres, and I guess to address that, we have the nonfiction in the sort of shades of yellow or orange. Then we have mystery thriller in the pinkish red. Then we have fantasy and sci-fi, which are usually my 2 biggest ones, next to horror in blue and purple. I should add that these here are kind of flexible. I read a lot of books that I would classify as a mix of fantasy and sci-fi, and whether or not I classify it as sci-fi or fantasy is purely up to my opinion. It isn't necessarily based off of what the majority of people rated on Goodreads. Maybe I should just combine them already, but I like having them separated. And then there's contemporary classics and historical, not listed in here because I didn't read it, or literary fiction. And I have a goal. Oh my God, that's huge. Bug. I have a goal to read 1 classic a month, and I've been allowing myself to substitute for that a work of literary fiction, something like Atwood or Toni Morrison, who some might classify as classics, but I consider more as literary fiction. But even then, you can see I let myself slack since the quarantine has started, and I've really not been focusing on that. That's something I'm going to make a conscious effort to try and address in the ending months of the year. Other than that, I'm happy. If we compare this to my first quarter, you'll see not much has changed. I've read a bit more history, a little less science. I'm fine with that. I've also had more horror. Honestly, I'd like my horror to be equal to that of fantasy and sci-fi. And if we take the average of 16 and 11, 17, so 18, about 9. So it's on par. I haven't read as many mystery thrillers, and I have a lot on my shelf that I need to get to. It's just, I think mystery thrillers honestly aren't something I'm that thrilled about. I like a thriller if it's a horror. Otherwise, I think I'm finding I'm not that appealed to them. That said, I've read some amazing ones, so maybe I'm wrong. Like, there were some that I really loved. If We Were Villains by Emil Rio. I loved Girls Gone Brighter. These books were some of my favorite books of last year. I think it's just a matter of being more cautious in the books that I buy in the mystery thriller section. Moving on to the second quarter, where I get my books from. Maybe I should have started with this. I don't know. How I get my books, how I choose them. It's important to me to think about where I'm getting my books from. There's unread, or unowned rather, which is to say that I don't own a physical copy. My general rule of reading a book is I have to own it physically to listen to the audiobook, because most of my reading is audiobooks, but I want to own it physically, like a trophy almost. And unowned would be books that I listen to without owning, which usually this either has to be an e-arc or it might be for a book club, which I'm trying to participate in more book clubs. And it's one of those things where I would rather listen to the book and then wait for the price to go down or find it somewhere, like at a thrift store, before I buy it. So that's why I would have some of these unknowns. And then there's the new books that I bought in 2020. These are books that are technically owned, but it's important to me that I also balance that with books from my TBR, books that I bought before 2020. And this is what I was talking about before, wanting to read more of my backlist titles. And my goal here is, I think, probably 3/4. So I'm clearly not reaching that, but I've got nearly 2/3, which isn't that bad. I've debated on how to classify my backlist. Like maybe 2019 and 2020 should be 1 year. I don't know. I'd love some feedback. I might change it next year. Comparing this to last quarter, you'll see there's a decrease from the TBR. And that's because I've gotten more into themed reading vlogs, and I'll go out of my way to buy newer books. Moving on to diversity of authors. So one thing I should say is that before this quarter, I classified mine as non-people of color and people of color, and I didn't break it down. And I've decided to try and break it down moving forward, because it's important to me to read more than just generally people of color. I want to read a diversity of authors from a diversity of different backgrounds, and I'm trying to think about how best to do that. The problem is there's such a diversity of ethnicities out there. I don't want to just pretend like they're all could be classified into one sliver, and I know that's not the case. So what I've done is instead try to think about the broadest types of ethnicities we see around the world. Inside of those, I'm going to try and be critical of what books I'm reading and make sure I'm reading a diverse list of creators within those lists themselves. But what I've done is I broke it down into non-people of color authors, black authors, Asian authors, South Asian, which would be like India and basically below China, general area. And then you don't see it here, but there's also East Asia, which would be the Middle East basically. And then Latinx authors, who could range from a variety of different backgrounds. Others that aren't listed here, let's go ahead and jump to comparing this to the first quarter, because it wasn't a good quarter for reading diversely. The first quarter, I also read Indigenous authors and Pacific Islander authors, and that did not happen this quarter. I have in the third quarter, and clearly it's something I need to make a more conscious effort to do, because I have books by Indigenous authors that I would have loved to have read if I had thought to think that, Josh, you need to read more Indigenous authors. Same with Pacific Islander authors. These are things I need to think about, and seeing this discrepancy helps me do that, will help me do that moving forward, to stop and think about what I'm reading. Honestly, the rest of the year will probably be targeted towards improving my stats, my diversity of what I'm reading. You also just see a general drop in the number of people of color that I read. It definitely went down. The biggest for both times is going to be black authors, and I think part of the reasons why it was so high in the first quarter, it was because of Blackathon. And in the second quarter, which includes Queer Blackathon, clearly I still could have stand to read more. The fact that I'm reading so much more during Blackathon as opposed to now tells you that I need to be more consistent. Now moving on to the gender of the authors, what you'll see is there's not much change from the first quarter. I read majority female authors, which I'm fine with. I'm all too familiar with the male perspective. That said, when it comes to queer or people of color authors, I think it's important that I try to get a balance of both genders. So maybe I should be more particular here. It's just that back in 2015, I noticed that I overwhelmingly read men over women, and I made a conscious effort to try and stop that. Now I watch so many women on BookTube that I think that is a big reason why I read more women now. That said, I think I'm also just more hesitant to buy men as authors. I don't know. I'm hesitant to fall back into the area that I was before. The one area that I'm really concerned with is my non-binary authors. I read one non-binary author this quarter and none the first quarter. Moving forward, I think I'll include cis men, cis women, and then trans authors and non-binary authors. That way I can make a more concerted effort to get to a wider variety of genders out there. And then moving on to queer rep, I'm not going to compare this to the first quarter, because the first quarter I read literally no queer rep. Queer rep here represents queer authors or queer stories. I struggled with how to break this down. And this was because I realized I wasn't reading anything queer in the first semester the first quarter. And as a queer person, I think it's really important that I read more queer authors. So I say to do it this way. It's something I need to definitely increase on. I bought a lot more queer literature, particularly queer people of color, and queer men, queer non-binary folks, because like I said, I have a problem with not reading enough variety of gender authors as well. And those are all my stats. The second quarter wasn't a bad reading session in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways it was. I'm really concerned with my decrease in the people of color that I'm reading, but I'm glad I did this, even though it's like a month and a half late, because of the fact that I'm now aware of how my reading is flawed, and it's a way to move forward. It's also just, I love the statistics, so it's a lot of fun, and this is great. So I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know your thoughts on this, and if you have any input on how I do my statistics, or how you think I could improve them, I would love the feedback. I'm always looking for ways to better visualize my reading traits. And as always, hope you have a great day, and stay safe. Goodbye.